Gardens. I know a lot of you are interested in it, so let's welcome Betsy.
Thank you. So, to talk about Missouri Botanical Garden, or as it was known for years and really still is Shaw's Garden. It was this man's dream. He was able to achieve it, to undertake the start and completion. Well, I shouldn't say completion, it's still a process in the works of a botanical garden here in St. Louis. And he wanted something that would rival the gardens that he saw on a European tour. He was 89 when he died, and the garden had already been open since 1859. These are some of the men and women in the background. It's hard to trace back. There's ripples here that some women had a hand in some of the things that have occurred at the Botanical Garden, but it's very hard to find that documentation. So we'll meet these people as we go through the program. Okay, so Henry Shaw was born in Sheffield, England, July 24th, 1800. He was the oldest of 4 children. He had 2 younger sisters, Carolyn and Sarah. He had a younger brother who died as an infant. And Sheffield, England at that time was a heavy manufacturing industrial town. Description here that was included in Daniel Defoe's A Tour Through the Whole of the Island of Great Britain describes that the houses are dark black, occasioned by the continued smoke of the forges, which are always at work. Here they make all sorts of cutlery ware, especially edged tools, knives, razors, axes, and nails. So Henry Shaw's family was involved in this kind of business. They made things like ironware, grates, fire irons, cutlery. And their business had run into some financial issues, as I gather from reading different things. So his father had the idea of coming to the New World to see what they could create for business here. There are also some allusions to the fact that perhaps he had some creditors that he couldn't meet his obligation with, so he left the country and came to the United States. His father, Joseph, emigrates to Canada, and he remains in Canada. He never does come to the United States. Some point along the line, Henry is sent down to New Orleans. 2 different possible reasons for this. One is that he was to handle some kind of a hardware shipment coming over from Sheffield. The other speculation is that he was to learn the cotton business. That does not seem to have happened. It seems that he stayed with the hardware business. So in 1819, he leaves New Orleans and travels to the port of St. Louis. That journey upriver takes him 40 days. And he's traveling on this steamship, the Maid of New Orleans. And his fare at that time was $120, which strikes me as being rather expensive for that time. Yeah.
Wow.
Other thing you need to remember as we're thinking about this, that Louisiana Purchase had just happened in 1803. So this country that he's traveling through, up from New Orleans to St. Louis, is wilderness. Okay, there it goes. Scenes like this, he probably passed on his way. He arrives at the small village of St. Louis, which is a busy port. Sees things happening like this. At this point, that port, the little village of St. Louis, extends 3 blocks west from the river and a mile north and south up and down the river. He starts his hardware business, selling to various kinds of people, soldiers, pioneers going west, businesses there in what had been a French settlement. And he expands that business and begins to become involved in agriculture, mining, very successful with real estate and also fur trade. At the age of 39, he has amassed enough fortune to be able to retire and live independently. He focuses on more real estate, and he also does, as I think was typical at the time of young men, were supposed to take the grand European tour as part of their education. And it's on that tour that he becomes exposed to some of these gorgeous gardens in Great Britain. And he becomes a fairly well-respected amateur botanist. By the time 1859, he is able to open the garden and to start his dream of having this botanical garden. He starts this in 1842. He makes a real estate purchase where the red arrow is, that rectangle there, number 3, is part of something that was called the Prairie, D-E-S-N-O-Y-E-R-S. Open prairie. Looks very different from the way we now see it. This was an artist's interpretation of what St. Louis looked at this time, and on the opposite bank of the river, really wilderness. So in 1851, Henry Shaw has taken this European tour. He visits the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, which is down here in your lower right. He visits the Crystal Palace here in the lower left, which was Prince Albert's brainchild. And then he visits this estate at Chatsworth and its huge gardens. And so he comes back to St. Louis determined that he can create something like he saw there. And in 1859, he sets up the will. He creates his garden as a charitable trust. And that's the way it exists today, as a charitable trust. He follows the advice of leading botanists of his time. These 3 gentlemen are very influential in how that garden was originally created. Take a look at who these fellows are. Asa Gray was really the prominent, preeminent botanist of the 19th century. George Engelmann was German. He moves to St. Louis, 1835, settles here. He is a physician, but he's also a botanist and a meteorologist, and he is very involved with Henry Shaw in creating the garden. And then Sir William Hooker was the first director of Kew Gardens, and he also gives Henry advice on what this garden should be. The garden, as you see it there, east-west, were originally laid out by Shaw himself with the help of a horticulturist by the name of James Gurney. We'll see some about him in a bit. And it was really based on 3 sections. The Arboretum, which was on the southern section of that, it's now where the Japanese garden is. That center section, 6 acres, something called a fruticetum, and then the flower gardens. They all, the plantings and everything flanked that central axis, and it linked the garden with his estate there in the Tower Grove house. So what is a fruticetum? I had never seen that word prior to looking at doing this program. It is a garden specifically designed for shrubs and fruit trees. And it's a learning garden to help horticulturists learn about the cultivation and maintenance of those particular plants. So the fellow who helped Henry Shaw with this, James Gurney, was an Englishman. He had been a gardener at Kew. Lots of connections here with Kew Garden, you'll see as we go through. He moves to the U.S. at age 36, and he was going to go to California. However, fortunately for the garden, There was an epidemic probably of cholera out there in California. So he stayed here in St. Louis. And he looks up Henry Shaw, having heard that he's starting a new garden, and offers to work for him. He's hired on, and he eventually goes to the position of a head gardener. And to kind of understand what that head gardener is, it's all-inclusive. He was everything. He was the timekeeper, label maker, foreman, kept the keys, did the actual planting and planning for the gardens, and he was the personnel department. His specialty, and the thing that he was most influential, biggest interest specialist, I guess is the word I'm searching for, is water lilies. And he figured out a way to grow this particular water lily. This is that great big huge one, if you've seen it at the Botanical Garden. I mean, massive leaves. He figures out a way to grow these here in St. Louis in a heated pool, because these plants are actually from the Amazon basin. So the flowers on that plant, if you picture it, 20 inches wide, huge. The leaves 9 feet wide.
Oh my gosh.
And the stalk coming up from the roots at the bottom of the pool, something like 20 feet long. Supposedly supports 71 pounds.
Jeez.
You may have seen this picture. There's a little bit of fudging going on with this picture. There is actually a table underneath that leaf that she's standing on.
Oh, you can see it.
Yep. This is a flyer. It is talking about Tower Grove Park, but it's the same period of time. They also had water lily pools. This is a map of what this area looks like. It's open prairie. There's no forest here. You can see where some things have been planted, particularly around the garden there. But at the time that that was started, it was wide open prairie. 1849, Tower Grove House is built, and this was Shaw's country home. His city home was down at, I think it's 7th and Chestnut. After his death, the first director of the garden lives here. In 1912, it becomes a classroom and administrative offices. And of course, today, it's basically a museum. And that's the way it looked, a bit different than the way we see it today. That's Henry Shaw at about this time. So June 15th, 1859, the Botanical Garden opens. It's open 6 days a week and 2 Sundays during the summer. That is the old entrance. We now refer to it as Spink, S-P-I-N-K Pavilion. But this originally was the entrance to the garden. Same year, the museum building is completed with its murals. And its purpose was part of that twofold program for the garden, not only pretty plants to look at, but also a scientific mission. And early on, this served as the herbarium. That's the way it looks today. And of course, as it was remodeled here, I don't know, what is that now, 5 years ago maybe. So it was becomes handicap accessible. Take a look for a minute at what's happened here to St. Louis. 1809, that settlement right along the riverfront. 1841, it's expanded out to 14th Street. By 1855, we're up here to Grand Boulevard. So it has not yet reached 1855, where the garden is located. Yeah. excuse me, tickle. Again, what St. Louis looked like at this time. Again, another map here of the garden. That way, Tower Grove here. Open land, no trees, very little, except what has been planted in the Botanical Garden. This is one of the earliest photographs. How different does that look from what we see today? It's mind-boggling, it really is, as to how much that has changed from about 1860. This area is now where the Japanese garden is. That was part of the Arboretum, and it was a working farm. There's an area here in the garden, sunken garden, it was called a parterre, which is a garden. It's got ornamental, intricate plantings there of different specimen plants. That's typically a Victorian age kind of garden. And again, several years later, another map. It looks very much the same. That original tract of land that Henry bought was 760 acres. And over time, a lot of that was sold off. The garden now is at 79 acres. I'm not sure what the size of Tower Grove Park is. This is the first mausoleum that Henry had built for his eventual gravesite. It was made out of native limestone, and after it had been put up, Henry became worried as to how that limestone would hold up over time. So instead of using it for his burial place, there was a statue that was moved in called the Victory over Ignorance Science. I think it was originally Victory over Ignorance. Shadow there through the window. The second mausoleum he has built is made out of red granite, and that does become his eventual gravesite. He poses for the statuary he wants on top of that. Okay, come on. Turns out a bit different than what he asked for, but that is their present day. 1888, we have this greenhouse in hedge garden. This is what it would look like as you came in Spink, or Floral Gate, as it was called, and look west. Now it's the location of the climatron. And to look at it a little bit closer up, that's the statue of Juno. She eventually she gets a new home. Another look at that. It's eventually torn down in 1916. A lot of storm damage to all of that glass, so it is replaced. 1883, Linnaean House is completed to house palms, citrus trees, tender plants, basically kind of a greenhouse. This is the way it looks today. And if you've ever come through that entrance and looked up to notice those three busts up above the south door, those are to commemorate three notable botanists at the time the garden was opened. Carl Linnaeus, Thomas Nuttall, who was a prominent botanist. He did a lot of exploration in the American West, finding plants, figuring out where they fit into the general taxonomy of plants, and Asa Gray, who we met before. So it's undergone different revisions, different uses, but the current remodeling returns it to its original purpose. Today it's on the National Historic Landmark. It's the oldest continually operated greenhouse west of the Mississippi. And this is the way we see it today. Let me just do this. Then again, there's another statue close up there of Juno, where she had been located up until 1916. This is another flyer from that time, copyright 1898, showing that same scene. This is one of the cactus design gardens. You may have seen something like this now. We call them knot gardens. That's along the walkway there by the Victorian Gardens. 1800s, there was a lodge and restaurant back on the southeast corner of the garden. Today, it's where the director's residence is, if you've been back that direction. It's kind of off the general beaten path. That's Henry Shaw on his 85th birthday. And that same year, he founds a School of Botany at Washington University. And this scientist, William Trelease, is hired as a professor there at the university and as an employee of the Botanical Garden. And he is going to become influential. He eventually, after Henry's death, becomes the first director of the Botanical Garden. Henry Shaw dies August 25th, 1889. Normally, during the hot summer months, no air conditioning, of course, those days, he normally went north to Wisconsin, couldn't make the trip. 1889, his health was not good, and on August the 25th, he passes away. He lies in state in that museum building. And at that point, your probable mode of transportation to get to the garden would have been one of these streetcars. So William Trelease is appointed the first director of the garden. And this was really according to Henry Shaw's will. And he holds that post for 23 years. And he's really tasked with a monumental job of converting Henry's private estate to a scientific and educational institution. He organizes the original herbarium. Looks something like this, very small, $600, something like 60,000 specimens. And of course today that herbarium has been expanded. Millions of plants, information on vascular, non-vascular plants. 2018 there was something like 7 million specimens, originally 60,000. He and his family live in Tower Grove House, 7th and Locust. This was Henry's city home. His will, he specified that it was to be broken down and reassembled in the Botanical Garden, and it is now the administration, which is on the southeast side of the garden, back by the director's home. This originally was called the Cleveland Gatehouse, completed in 1895. Henry had directed that it be constructed as a residence for the groundskeeper. Today, it's called Herring House. The very first chrysanthemum show, 1905, over 100,000 people attended. And this was outside. It was in tents outside of the Linnaean House. And after the show was over, the plants were collected to donate to charity. 1906, this gentleman arrives at the garden, George Pring, and he is influential in starting the garden's orchid collection. He's also very much interested in water lilies, and he does a lot of propagation of hybrid water lilies. He too, as some of these earlier men were, is from Kew Gardens. He becomes an orchid expert expands the collection from 300 plants to over 50,000. Some of this he does on planting expeditions to Central America, Panama. His wife starts the first garden volunteer program. And he also starts something that still exists today, and that's the Botanical Garden answer service, originally staffed by garden employees. Today, the email service is still staffed by a garden employee. Incoming phone calls are answered by staff or master gardeners who are present there in the Kipper Center. This is one of his hybrid water lilies. He is succeeded by Dr. George Moore. And he is influential in hiring this fellow, John Noyes, who was actually both a horticulturist, but he was actually a landscape architect. And he was very much involved in the addition of the palm house, the desert, the Mediterranean floral display houses, something that was called the Italian house, perennial gardens, the knolls, and those gardens around the Linnaean house and those pools that are on the south side of Linnaean house. He also creates the very first rose garden in the Botanical Garden, and he is able to receive rare specimens from Harvard. This is what that rose garden originally looked like. 1915, the palm house replaces that greenhouse that we saw earlier with the statue of Juno. This too becomes storm damage as an event and is eventually replaced, and the climatron is now there. And you can see it looks very much the same. You're familiar with that as you look east from the palm house. You see the floral gate, Spink Pavilion, across those pools. 1915, the garden is finally open 7 days a week, year-round. 1916, the director's residence is built. 1920s, horrible, horrible air pollution from the burning of soft coal. We get things that look like this. It seems to me you'd be afraid to breathe with that. Horrible. And it was damaging the plants of the Botanical Garden, particularly its orchid collection. So the garden purchases the property at Gray Summit. And 3 years later, the orchid collection is moved from St. Louis out to Gray Summit. 1940, it's actually open to the public. During the war years, World War II, the garden's involved with Victory Gardens, different kinds of gardening efforts, morale kinds of things. There's a year-round flower show during the Depression. In 1946, storms, tornadoes, trees come down, that museum building is damaged. Part of that stone wall on the east side is damaged, but repaired. Looks like new. The next director of the garden, very short period of time, is Dr. Anderson. I think he must have been a bit of a character when you read about him. When he finally decides to leave the position, he creates a new position for himself called Curator of Useful Plants, whatever that means. He writes a lot of technical papers and also popular articles. One entitled, How to Spend a Nice Evening with a Potato. So we meet the fourth garden director. This is Dr. Fritz Wendt, and it's during his time that the climatron construction begins and is completed. As I said, it's built on the side of that old palm house, which had also received damage with all that glass across the ceiling and sides. It's really susceptible to hail damage. 1960, the climatron opens. And we see it today looking like this. 1963, that garden behind Tower Grove House becomes an herb garden donated by the St. Louis Herb Society, partially maintained by them. And then in 2013, there's a container garden that is put in just south of that herb garden. 1964, George Pring retires. And after he dies, there are 2 memorial plaques dedicated to him at the garden. David Gates is now our next director. And we find the Garden Gate Shop is opened 1965. The Garden Guide program is begun, and it becomes the Garden Docent program. Come up to 1971, when Dr. Peter Raven becomes the 6th director of the Botanical Garden. Find this building that's built as part of the herbarium. Again, it's back in that southeast corner of the garden. Groundbreaking for the Japanese garden in 1973. This is a watercolor sketch by the landscape architect who created that garden. Dedicated in 1977. Scenes like this. If we take a look at the purpose of this, it's a particular type of Japanese garden that should have hidden views, use of natural materials, irregular shapes. Can't pronounce Japanese, but it's authentic to the pond strolling garden style of the late 19th century, featuring open lawns surrounding a large lake. And we have scenes then like this, feeding the koi fish.
Oh boy.
1974, a second rose garden, the Lehman Rose Garden, is installed. And there's a fountain across from that Lehman building, the Schoenberg fountain that's put in. Woodland Garden opens in 1976. And as we see it today. 1982, the front entrance is moved from the Floral Gate Speak Pavilion area to Ridgeway Center, facing north, the north parking lot. And of course, last year it was redone, remodeled, and is now the Taylor Visitor Center. The Rock Garden opened in 1982. The Zimmerman Scented Garden the same year. Shortly after that, 1984, the Iris Garden is put in and opened. 4 years after that, the Daylily Garden, the Jenkins Daylily Garden. And this is a sanctioned American Hemerocallis Society display garden. It meets their requirements to have that title and that designation. The woman who designed these was not Jenkins. She was a different individual. Mary Schnarr, if I remember correctly, created those beds in those arch shape. She wanted them to look like rainbows. And she specified that the colors would be mixed. She didn't want all orange together and all yellow together, but wanted the colors mixed. That was her vision. Kemper Gardens, 1991. And we have 23 little sub-garden areas there that make up that area of the Kemper Visitor Center, Center for Home Gardening. 1996, the Chinese Friendship Garden is installed. It's modeled after something called Scholars Gardens. It's smaller, less ornate than the huge imperial gardens. The hardscape for that was created and put together in Nanjing and then reconstructed at the garden on site, put together and installed. Prominent colors: black, white, gray, reddish brown, the traditional colors of that style of Chinese garden. Blanky Boxwood Garden went in 1996. Entrance remodeled in 2009. It has an interesting connection back to that fella who was the director of the Botanical Garden in '54. He was very interested in boxwood, and there's something like, where's my reference there? I think 60 different kinds all overall. And if you ever walked back in this area, if you know, the gazebo is up over there, but there's steps up here, and there's a bench back here, and that is an area designated to Dr. Anderson. The observatory, 1996. And of course, the Monsanto Center, now where the herbarium is located. Interesting building, supposed to be earthquake-proof, now called the Bayer Center. Scientific staff that work there. There was an article recently about this woman, Charlotte Taylor, who has worked there for 41 years, working on the taxonomy of different plants and where they fit into plants that exist, finding some that have never been noted before. Carver Garden, 2005, a sculpture by Tina Allen. Doris Schnook Children's Garden, 2006. The Ottoman Garden, also in 2006, toward the front of the garden. And then this Victorian district, designated in 2007. And here again we have the statue of Juno in her new location. She faces the Tower Grove House. Strassenfest Garden is again back in that southeast corner of the garden. Doesn't get a lot of attention, doesn't get a lot of visitors. So Dr. Peter Weiss Jackson became the director in 2010, and he has now put in his resignation, and the search is on for a replacement for Dr. Weiss Jackson. There are a lot of sculptures and fountains across the Botanical Garden. I thought this was kind of interesting, a quote here from Dr. Raven talking about the patterns of the environment set up a rhythm into which the sculpture can blend, an interaction of man and nature. Those three angels with the instruments are by Carl Mills. So designation here from Henry Shaw's original will. The garden should be accessible to the general public, forever kept up, maintained for the cultivation, propagation of plants, flowers, fruit, and forest trees. And then the science side of this, and a museum and library connected therewith and devoted to the science of botany, horticulture, and allied objects. So that was Henry Shaw's dream that he created, and the men along the line who have, I guess, continued that vision, changed the garden, and made it into what we now see it today. So, comments, questions? Yeah, that garden in Tower Grove were his gift to St. Louis. Yes?
I'm curious how many pieces of chihuly the garden bought.
Ooh, you know, I don't know the count. And some of those were moved when that visitor center was taken down. And yeah, I don't know. I'll have to check that.
Because the blue and white one's hanging in
It is now in the climatron. Yeah. And I don't know, I can't remember that sunburst that used to be across the fence in the rose garden.
Yeah, they're still.
Is that back?
I think they're back, yes.
I walk by there and don't notice.
Oh, they're pretty.
Yeah, yeah.
The garden
Yes,
Really is.
How many acres does the garden contain now
79.
as opposed to when it was original?
No, I think that is the original size. It, however, is not the original size of Henry Shaw's prairie purchase. That was 760 acres. A lot of that was to the west there, you know, where Alfred runs along the west side of the garden.
Yes.
That area, and I'm not sure whether that went to Kings Highway or beyond, that was sold. That was eventually sold off.
Thank you.
What else? Yes.
How many employees?
I don't know.
A lot.
A lot. How about how many volunteers?
I was just going to say, I bet
A
there's
lot.
more volunteers than there are employees.
It could be. We put in an awful lot of hours donated to the garden. Yeah. Doing some of the hands-on things, some of the things that maybe the horticulture staff is glad to have somebody else do. A lot of weeding, pruning, grooming. When they install those plantings, like in the Victorian garden, the young lady who designed that had a specific diagram as to how that should look. But things grow at different rates, so periodically something that's moved out of its designated space has to be cut back and put back where it's supposed to be. Yeah.
What do you have to do to be a master gardener?
You have to take a class from January to May, 3 hours on Thursday. Learn all about the different aspects of gardening. A number of the instructors are horticulture staff from the garden itself, or people who are well known in the community to be experts in their field. Yeah. We agree when we're finished that we will put in 50 hours a year. Return that. I think a good number of us put in a lot more than that. I volunteer there every Wednesday morning from end of March to the end of October, working outside with the staff horticulturist. I also work every other Tuesday morning at the Kemper Center behind the desk there, answering people's questions. Keeps you on your toes.
Okay.
Keep thinking. Anybody else? Have you been into the new center?
Yes.
What was your reaction to the?
It's very
It's
modern,
different. Very
Yes.
modern,
very different.
Very
Yes.
Very different, very
Yeah.
modern.
I find that the plantings, as you first walk into the garden, that whole mission has changed, and it has become part of that scientific aspect. A lot of those things are not native to the Midwest or even to the United States. So it's kind of an experiment to see if they will grow. What I wish, if I could wave a magic wand, they need more signage out there, I think, to explain to the public what it is they're trying to achieve with that.
I like the other one.
Did you?
Do you think Shaw would have been disappointed at the new entry?
Hard to say
Hard to say. We don't know.
what Henry Shaw would think of the new entrance.
What was the answer?
And then I guess that kind of dichotomy that he originally set up between having pretty flowering display things and having the scientific aspect of that, I think are always kind of pulling each other. If you've got a pool of money, which way do you go to it, and how do you balance that? Yeah, it's interesting.
That's a good point.
Yes.
Would Shaw's Garden be considered one of the best in the world, or any organization ranked the various?
Yeah, you see rankings. I'm not sure where it stands currently. Haven't checked that. Yes.
few years ago, I was in Canada.
Yes.
And I had a plant in my garden that wasn't thriving. So I went up to the person who was answering these questions and I said, now I asked this question at the Missouri Botanical Garden, at which point he interrupted me and said, now you're really putting
The pressure on him.
And that's when I knew that it was famous worldwide.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And a lot of that scientific work that they are doing, particularly there's a huge presence in Madagascar to help preserve that island's plants, flora and fauna, so that they aren't destroyed. Yes. Gentlemen, you had a question.
Oh, are there many geodesic domes like this around the world?
Boy, there certainly were. When was that? Was that the 60s, 70s? They were all over the place. I don't know how many of those have survived. Anybody else? Well, thank you for coming. Enjoyed your interest and questions.
Thank you.